We've seen that price floors and taxes reduce social welfare, but there are lots of other policies that also reduce social welfare. Some examples are price ceilings, tariffs, and quotas. So let's see how we would analyze some of these. The method of analysis is pretty much the same as what we've seen for price floors and taxes. You first determine the competitive equilibrium. You calculate the consumer and producer surplus at the competitive equilibrium. You determine the equilibrium with the policy. You calculate the consumer surplus, producer surplus, and any other revenue and expenditure caused by the policy. And then you look at the differences between the total welfare without the policy and the total welfare with the policy to determine what the effect of the policy is. So let's look at some applications to trade. So we can compare the welfare under free trade versus policies like bans on imports, quotas imports, and so forth. So let's look at free trade versus a ban on imports. So let's suppose we looked at the US market for crude oil. The domestic demand is described by the demand function D of P is 48.71 times P to the negative 0.25. The domestic supply is 3.45 times P to the quarter. And this is domestic supply, so this is the American supply, SA. The foreign supply, so the world supply for this good, for crude oil, is a horizontal line at the price of $60. So, what does the situation look like if we want to solve for the equilibrium without the ban? So we look at the equilibrium when there's no restriction on importation of oil. Well, we've got our demand curve. And what does the supply curve look like? Well, at any price below $60, you're only going to have domestic supply. But as soon as you hit the $60, now the foreign suppliers, the world supply is, you can get any quantity you want at the price of 60. So the market supply is going to be, you're going to follow the American supply up to the price of 60, and at the price of exactly 60, foreign suppliers will give you any quantity you want. So the equilibrium is going to be where the domestic demand curve crosses this market supply. So if we solve that, we would find that the equilibrium price without a ban on imports would be 60, and the equilibrium quantity would be 17.5. So the consumer surplus is going to be the area under the demand curve above the price. So it's going to be area A plus area B plus area C. The producer surplus is the area above the supply curve below the price, which is only the area D. So the total welfare is the sum of A, B, C, and D. Now let's look at what happens when you impose a ban. If you ban imports, the supply curve in the American market is just going to be the American supply curve. It's going to be the domestic supply curve because of foreign supply is banned. So then we can look for the competitive equilibrium with no imports, and we'll find that the equilibrium quantity is 13, equilibrium price is 199.34. Just like before, we can figure out what the consumer and producer surpluses are. The consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve above the new price, so it's just area A. The producer surplus is the area above the supply curve below the new price, so that's areas B and D together. So area A is the consumer surplus. Areas B and D together are the producer surplus. So the total welfare is A plus B plus D. So what's the change in welfare due to the ban? Well, the consumers lose B and C. They used to get A, B, and C. Now they just get A. The producers gain B. They used to get D only. Now they get both B and D, so they gain B. So the total welfare loss is C. So the consumers are losing out on this whole area, and the producers are recovering only this part of it. So C doesn't get recovered, and that's the deadweight loss from banning imports. What if we had a tariff on imports? So we can stick with the same example and consider a $40 tariff on imports. So the domestic demand curve and the domestic supply curve are going to be exactly the same. However, the foreign supply shifts upwards by $40 because this tariff is as if you're imposing a tax of $40 on imported oil. So compared to the free trade situation, we're going to have the tariff equilibrium have a higher price and a lower quantity. So we're going to go from the equilibrium being here before the imposition of the tariff to the equilibrium being over here. The quantity decreases down to 15.4 and the price rises from $60 to $100. The consumer surplus in this situation is going to be the area above the price of 100 and below the demand curve. So that's just the area A. The producer surplus is going to be the area above the supply curve and below the price of 100. So it's areas B and F. So we've got B and F. For every extra unit that's not supplied by the American suppliers, the government is going to collect a tariff. So how many units is going to be imported into the United States? Well, we can look at the amount that's supplied by the American suppliers and subtract that from the total amount that's consumed. So the gap is what's imported. At the price of 100, American suppliers supply 10.9 units. The total amount that's consumed is 15.4. So the difference between those two, so 4.5 units, are imported. So for each of those 4.5 units, the government collects $40. So this area D is government revenue. So the total welfare is A plus B plus F plus D. There should be a plus D here. The change is in the last column. What do the consumers lose? The consumers used to get A, B, C, D, and E. Now they just get A, so they're losing B, C, D, and E. The American producers used to get only F, but now they get B and F. So B goes from the consumers to the producers. The government revenue is D. It used to be part of the consumer surplus, but now it's collected as government revenue. These portions C and E, however, are lost forever. And that's the deadweight loss. So C here, this little area C, and this little area E are the deadweight loss. What if instead of a tariff, the government just said, we're going to have a quota? Instead of these $40, the government says, okay, you can import, you don't have to pay the quota, but you can only import those 4.5 units. So the domestic supply at $100, remember, is 10.9, and the equilibrium quantity is 15.4. So the domestic supply and domestic demand don't change. The only difference going to be is that the government is not going to collect tariff. So the deadweight loss in this case would be you'd lose C and you'd lose E just like before, but now the government is not collecting any revenue. So that part gets lost as well. So what we see here is that a quota is worse than a tariff. You're always better off to have a tariff than you are to have a quota. So at least the government would be raising revenue. So why do we see these policies even though they reduce social welfare? The policies like a price floor or a ban on imports, these reduce social welfare by reducing the consumer welfare, and even though they increase the producer welfare, they don't increase the producer welfare by enough to make up for the loss in consumer welfare. So you'd be almost better off just taking money out of the consumer's pocket and handing it to the producer rather than having these policies. So why do we see them nonetheless? So a lot of these policies, like I said, carry a deadweight loss, yet we see them. When you have these policies, so even though we impose a tariff or a price floor, one of the sides is going to lose, one of the sides is going to win. And that's why we see these policies, because not everybody's going to be worse off for it. The winnings that one of the sides get is what we call economic rent. So they have an incentive to lobby the government or policymakers to implement these types of policies. And this is called rent-seeking behavior. So an example might be that even though a tariff on foreign cars would hurt US consumers, a company like General Motors would have an incentive to lobby the American government to impose tariffs on imported cars. Now, it's the job of an economist to suss out the impact of these policies on different actors in the economy, and to look at the effect of a policy on the economy as a whole. And so it's our job to be able to figure out what is a good policy and what isn't. What is rent-seeking behavior, and to identify rent-seeking behavior, and only to implement those policies that are actually achieving a goal in an efficient way.